So let's take a check then on the front pages, and the Metro has more on the war of words between the shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry and ousted Labour MP Caroline Flint after Miss Flint alleged on Sky News this morning that Miss Thornberry had called her Northern Leave voters stupid. The Telegraph is also leading on the row within the Labour Party as senior party figures accuse the leadership of arrogance for suggesting that voters are to blame for the poor election result. The Eye says that Labour MPs have turned on Jeremy Corbyn as they look for a new leader to replace him. While The Guardian says the starting gun has already been fired in the race to succeed Mr Corbyn and take over the party leadership by the end of March. The Daily Mail reports that Boris Johnson's new government will prioritise border controls, the NHS and spending in the north to ensure the Conservatives stay in power for another decade. The Daily Express says that relations between the Prime Minister and the BBC are strained after Mr Johnson announced a proposal to end criminal penalties for viewers who don't pay the licence fee. The Financial Times reports that UN climate change talks have broken up in acrimony after the countries involved failed to agree on a future plan of action. And The Mirror has a story about an NHS worker who donated a kidney to a dying toddler. So Christina Patterson and Brendan O'Neill are here with me. Good to see you both. Obviously, the first time I've seen you since the election, so a lot to digest. And there's been a lot of analysis over the weekend, a certain amount of blame gaming going on as well. So let's take a look at the front page of The Telegraph, and they're reflecting on Labour talking about what went wrong and talking about its plans for the future. Their headline, Labour war as stupid, in inverted commas, voters get the blame.
Yes, so civil war has erupted in the Labour Party, and this story in particular refers to Caroline Flint, the outgoing Labour MP for Don Valley in Yorkshire, says that Emily Thornberry described Northern voters as stupid. Apparently, she said to a Northern MP, at least my constituents aren't as stupid as yours. Now, Emily Thornberry denies having said this.
That's right. She says it's a total and utter lie. I've never said this to anyone or anything like it, and I hope, needless to say, that it's not something I would ever think.
Yeah. I must say, I'm inclined to believe Caroline Flint. I actually think Caroline Flint has been one of the best Labour MPs over the past few months. She has really tried her best to keep the party in touch with its working-class heartlands, and the party just didn't do that. But I think what's really interesting about this Emily Thornberry story, or this Emily Thornberry allegation, it does speak to certainly how lots of Labour voters started to feel that the core of the Labour Party was just looking down its noses at them, that they thought they were racist, they've been hoodwinked by tabloid newspapers, they're all a bit dim, they voted for Brexit but they didn't really know what they were voting for. There is a palpable sense in Labour heartlands that Labour, the leaders of the Labour Party and the membership of the Labour Party, which is much, much more middle class than traditional heartland Labour voters, that machinery of the party was looking down its nose at the voters. And so this story will touch a nerve with huge numbers of Labour voters who will think to themselves, that feels right. It feels right that Emily Thornberry and those kinds of people would hold those views.
And you think that even though Labour didn't come down on the side of Remain, they said we will renegotiate and we'll put it back to the people, they still feel that it was a Remain message?
Absolutely. You know, because Labour said it would hold a second referendum, and to lots of Leave voters, and most of these Labour voters who've turned away from Labour are Leave voters, that felt like a betrayal of the first referendum and a betrayal of the first vote. So I don't think it matters that, you know, you had the Lib Dems on one side saying we'll unilaterally revoke Article 50 and just stop Brexit entirely. But then you had Labour saying we'd have another referendum. To voters who really want us to leave the European Union, that just sounds like the same thing. We will make null and void the first vote in 2016 and either make you vote again or scrap your vote entirely. And, you know, Northern voters, despite what some people might think, are not stupid, and they know what that means. That means overthrowing the largest democratic vote in history.
And Christina, Jeremy Corbyn has apologised today for
he has not
the loss. Well, he has. He said the words, I'm sorry.
Look, none of them, as far as I can tell, John McDonnell, and we'll get onto that later, is the only one who's come anywhere near anything approximating an apology. Jeremy Corbyn has refused to apologise for anything ever. He hasn't apologised properly about anti-Semitism. He refused every single time that Andrew Neil raised that in his interview. He refused to apologise.
I think he did in a later interview,
eventually,
didn't
he made
Yes.
some mealy-mouthed non-apology, and he's doing exactly the same now. He actually has had the arrogance to say, we won the argument. You know what? If you'd won the argument, you'd have won the election. These people are utterly delusional. And actually, I don't think Brendan and I agree about all that much, but I do agree that the Labour policy, this so-called constructive ambiguity, was never going to appeal to anyone because, of course, if you voted Leave, the last thing you wanted is another referendum, even if it is some unicorn-like referendum that is apparently going to preserve every right you ever had and make, everything marvellous while also separating us economically from the EU. It was a completely non-credible option.
But am I right in thinking that you would have liked Labour to have adopted a Remain policy?
Well,
and do you think that the result would have been even worse if they had done that?
I think it's very hard to say because, as far as I'm concerned, the rot, actually, if I'm honest, I think the rot started setting in the Labour Party when Ed Miliband won the leadership. I remember exactly where I was when he won, and I thought, OK, this is it for Labour for a long time. And, of course, when Jeremy Corbyn won the leadership and then won it again when he was challenged, I thought, well, Labour's not going to be in power for years. And, of course, it's going to be probably a good decade before Labour in power again. But before it does that, it has to decide who it's for and what it is. And at the moment, it's a very uneasy alliance. I was going to say it's a very uneasy alliance of the so-called metropolitan elite, educated. And let's be clear, they're not an elite. This is university, for example, the young, by a vast majority voted for Jeremy Corbyn's Labour. University, we now have a situation where a much higher proportion of uneducated voters voted Tory and educated, in as far as anyone voted Labour, it was more likely to be, for example, people in university towns. But that is a very uneasy alliance, and Labour have not found a way of bridging it. And there is nothing they are currently offering that appeals to working class voters. They seem to have taken the view, under Jeremy Corbyn, that if you're working class, you're some poor victim who has to go to food banks all the time and is, starving in a hospital corridor. And of course, there have been scandals with the NHS and people in hospital corridors and so on. But to brand an entire class of society as victims is a very unwise policy because guess what? Most people want to do well in life. Most people wanted to earn a home, earn some money, do better, and Labour have completely ignored those people.
OK, let's move on and get a few more papers in. Let's just show the front page of the Metro, and they're pretty much picking up on the same spat that we've discussed there. Labour at each other's throats is their headline, which reflects the broader split, as you were talking about as well. And moving on to The Guardian, they also focus on what next for Labour, saying rivals poised for battle for Labour's future begins. And so the question now is, Brendan, who takes over the party and which direction does it go in?
I mean, that is the million-dollar question for Labour right now, and it doesn't look like they're coming up with very good answers. I mean, all the people they're pushing forward, Keir Starmer, Emily Thornberry, these are apparently people who are going to throw their names into the hat. Jess Phillips, I mean, these people are all Remainers, and I think that is really, really important. I mean, one of the points Caroline Flint makes is that she thinks the election was lost because of arch Remainers like Keir Starmer, like Emily Thornberry, who had no contact, no intellectual, political, moral contact with that vast swathe of the electorate who voted Leave. Not because they're stupid, not because they're racist, but because they want greater political sovereignty, because they want greater agency. I completely and utterly agree with Christina that there is this tendency among the Corbynista left to look at working class people as just pathetic. They can't afford food, their houses are falling down. It was actually summed up by the front page of the Mirror on election day, which said, vote for them. And it had all these photographs of just, rather pathetic people, hungry, starving, ill. It's an incredibly paternalistic message. And, shock horror, working class voters don't like to be depicted like that. They don't like to be treated like that. So this tension between a Labour Party which sees working class voters as rather weak and useless and needing to be saved, and working class constituencies themselves, which are saying, look, respect our agency, respect our vote, respect our desire for sovereignty. That tension is going to be huge over the next couple of years.
Yeah, but we are now talking, because of Corbyn and his acolytes, and Seamus Milne and McCluskey and all these people who managed to destroy a once great party, tragically, in my view. We're not talking about tomorrow, Brendan. We're talking about probably a 10-year project. And in 10 years, I don't think that the country will continue to define themselves by Remain or Leave. I really don't. I think it's unwise. I think, we need to look more long-term than that. And the idea that it's got to be, the new leader has to be a woman or has to be working class or has to be a northerner, that's irrelevant. We've got an old Etonian bloke, you couldn't really get posher, former member of the Bullingdon Club, who has apparently broken this red wall in the Midlands and the North. So I don't think your background is important. I think what's important is that you're a good leader, that you understand the issues, that you have a vision for the future. We are talking, Boris Johnson is clearly planning to reshape. The Tory party's already been reshaped. He's planning a revolution. We need an opposition who can also come up with something revolutionary for these very complex times, but that will get them elected.
I'm going to rush you on. I knew you were dying to get in there, and you caught my eye. But I just want to get the next paper in just before we go to the break, because we've got very little time. McDonnell takes it on the chin inside the Metro. This was his interview with Andrew Marr this morning, in which he said, I take the blame for this.
Well, at least somebody. I have some iota of respect for John McDonnell, because at least he has said, rather, I think unfairly, actually, he said, this one is on me. No, it's not on him. It's, I would say, Seamus Milne, McCluskey and Corbyn are, more culpable than he is. But anyway, he has taken some blame, but then he instantly went on to blame the media. A bad workman blames his tools. These are the tools available. You use them in the way if you don't use them well, you lose. They use them badly and they lost.
Does he have any point about the media? I mean, the newspapers have been very critical of Jeremy Corbyn. Do you think that's something that should be...
They have, but then there have been other newspapers and broadcasters that have been very critical of Boris and his what they refer to as his tendency to lie and everything else. So both sides have got it. Maybe Corbyn has got it more. But the point is, I think this is another aspect of the deeply patronising approach that the Corbynist, the left in particular, takes to ordinary people. This idea that they've been hoodwinked, brainwashed, led astray by tabloid newspapers. There's a famous bit of graffiti which gets shared online a lot, which says, when the working classes stop reading right-wing newspapers, then we might get progressive change. They have this horrible view of ordinary people as just being under the control of Rupert Murdoch, and it's just not true.
OK, we're going to take a break there. We've talked about Labour. We're going to talk about the Tories next and what Boris Johnson plans to do now that he has a working majority. That's coming up after the break. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview. With me tonight, Christina Patterson and Brendan O'Neill. And we're going to take a look. We talked a lot, as we said, about Labour. We're going to take a look now at Boris Johnson. But front page of the Daily Mail, they are talking about, it's going to be a big week this week. We're going to get the Queen's speech where Boris Johnson will lay out his priorities, and a little bit of that detail in the Daily Mail.
Well, I think Boris Johnson's priorities will be remarkably closely aligned with the priorities of the people who have just voted him in for 5 years. And I do think it's that way round, because there was almost nothing in the manifesto. And we all know that there was one slogan that was ruthlessly, brutally effective, which was get Brexit done, even though we could, in fact, in a year's time be facing in effect, a no-deal Brexit. So Brexit could be done in a very brutal way, which could harm some of the people who voted for him. But I don't think Boris Johnson had very much idea what he wanted to do in power. What we do know about him is that he's wanted to be in power for a very long time. And now that he has completely reshaped the Tory party by realising that the way to power was through the so-called red wall of former Labour voters, he has to keep them on board. It's like Trump keeping his base on board. So he has to provide infrastructure. Basically, he's got to throw billions at the North, and because the NHS is a strong polling issue, he's got to throw money at the NHS, and because law and order is a strong polling thing, and people who vote Tory, and particularly the working class people who've just got him into power, are very, very conservative on law and order and are very keen on the kind of Priti Patel type approach of, lock him up, throw away the key. This is what he's going to try and do. So I think he may actually come up with something that's pretty radical, but I very much doubt doubt that he believed these things before. I think it's simply pragmatism.
And how do you think that he is going to hold that coalition together of seats in the Shires and seats in former Labour heartlands? Do you think it's going to work, this kind of approach?
We'll have to wait and see, I guess. But it's a very, very curious alliance. You have the Toffs on one side, you know, including Boris himself, and then these working class people on the other, who many of whom have never voted for Tory. And some of these constituencies have been Labour for 70, 80 years. So it will be very interesting. But I'm actually relatively optimistic, because I think actually Johnsonism is actually something very, very new. This is not Thatcherism or Reaganism. It's very, very different to that. It's not gung-ho free market politics. It's actually leftish on public spending and investment, and there's going to be 100 billion investment in infrastructure in the Midlands and the North. And then it's socially conservative in relation to crime and other kind of social issues. So this is potentially a new kind of politics. Whether it will be enough to gel together these very different groups of people, we'll have to wait and see.
OK, and very quickly, let's take a look at the front page of The Express, because that's also a focus on what Boris Johnson is likely to do. And he's talked about the possibility of decriminalising the non-payment of the BBC licence fee.
Well, to be honest, this is the side of so-called Johnsonism that frightens me most, because this is when you begin to... Clearly, he wants to dismantle some of the institutions in this country. And the BBC, we are respected throughout the world. The BBC is respected throughout the world. The BBC World Service, for example, has played a huge role in our soft power. And I don't think the BBC has covered itself in glory in its election coverage, rather far from it. But we all make mistakes. And I think to start, in effect, dismantling the BBC, because once payment of the licence fee is not a criminal, or rather lack of it is not a criminal offence, then that will mean there aren't enough funds to continue it in its traditional form. So I think this is very worrying, and I think it reeks of Hungary. I think it reeks of countries that start dismantling the media they don't like.
I'm only cutting you off because we're really short of time. I want Brendan to have a word.
I actually think this is an interesting proposal. I think compelling people with the threat of criminalisation to pay for a TV service, I think, is possibly wrong in this era in which there is so much choice in relation to what you watch on the media. Maybe it should become a subscription service. And, you know, for a lot of people, the fact that they have to pay £154 a year, and if they don't, they will be taken to court, while BBC people like Gary Lineker get paid an awful amount of money, that is a bit of a problem for lots of people.
OK, something we might pick up again at 11:30, but for now we're out of time. Christina and Brendan, thanks both very much.
Thank you.